Rodney Needham came to our seminar at Berkeley, crossed the Bay Bridge from the peninsula of the Bay Area to Berkeley, came to our seminar, and he was a very impressive figure, dressed, in a beautiful shirt and tie, whereas some of my other professors were a little more casual. And then it's kind of interesting that I still remember the first sentence of his presentation 50 years later plus. And he said, we in social anthropology owe an enormous debt of gratitude to a small band of Alsatian Jews who founded sociology at the late 19th and early 20th century. And then he went on to talk about Emile Durkheim and Marcel Mauss and Robert Hertz. And so this was, it's kind of the oracular voice of Rodney Needham. And it was only later that I fully appreciated that he actually had been a hunter-gatherer specialist and done his field work in Borneo, in the northern, among the Penan, who are hunter-gatherers on the northern side of Borneo, the island of Borneo. And he had actually done some interesting ecological work on the Penan, even though his whole life's work had been built around kinship studies. And it was, so Rodney Needham came to visit our seminar, and I think it enhanced the quality of our conversations, because we felt at the time Needham was engaged in a very serious debate between David Schneider on the one hand and Needham on the other about what now seems like a very technical subject about prescriptive alliance, which is the question then, and I guess when I recount it, you'll say, oh, what was all the fuss about? But then there was a big issue. Does prescriptive alliance mean you must marry the appropriate cross-cousin, or you should marry the appropriate cross-cousin? And that was a very intense debate. And it was all about, I think, Needham claimed to be the interpreter of Claude Lévi-Strauss to the English-speaking world. And then I remember somewhat later, Lévi-Strauss said, I want to thank Professor Needham for his very kind interventions on my behalf, but in fact, he's really not representing my views accurately. And so we were all, this was the subject, this was the stuff of controversy in the 1960s. Needham being kind of distanced or disavowed by Lévi-Strauss, for whom he had declared his complete devotion. So since they're all dead and gone, I think we can, tell this story. Anyway, my focus in second year at Berkeley, my focus was on getting a field project underway where I was actually going to go out into the Kalahari Desert and look for hunting and gathering people, or people who were still hunting and gathering. And Desmond Clark was instrumental in helping me find find my way to some communities. So he had a colleague, an acquaintance in Botswana. And Botswana at the time, the year was 1962, Botswana was the Bechuanaland Protectorate under British colonial rule. And it was still years away from independence. And it's one of those, like the Needham and his small band of Alsatian Jews. I remember the first line when Professor Clark got a response from a colleague in Bechuanaland saying to who he had asked, where do you think my students should go to look for Bushmen who were still hunting and gathering? And the first line of the response was, Dear Desmond, I have to say things are really looking up in Lobatse since the abattoir was built. And that was the line. The abattoir had made an enormous difference. And at the time I laughed, the abattoir, but then when I got to Lobatse, I could see that the abattoir was processing carcasses of cattle and which were being shipped by rail to the ocean and then by refrigerator shipped to the European common market. And so there was actually a real serious intent behind it. Because until then, the people of Bechuanaland, the Tswana, had been grazing, hundreds of thousands of head of cattle in very marginal ecological environments and were degrading the soil terribly and also putting the hunter-gatherers out of business at the same time. So the abattoir was actually a blessing for relieving some of the enormous pressure on the land that overgrazing had created. So this gentleman in Lobatse had 3 or 4 suggestions of, well, your student could go here, could go there, have a look, and these are the best bets. So 1963 came around, and I'm a student at California, but my home is in Toronto, and I'm heading to Africa. And so DeVore had just accepted a professorship at Harvard University. I don't think he had yet taken up that professorship. But in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there was a very famous family, the Marshall family, who were the pioneers in the ethnography of the Bushmen, as they were then called, the Kung Bushmen, exclamation K-U-N-G. Their name has changed radically since then. So DeVore said, you really should stop in Cambridge on your way overseas and meet the Marshall family. And so I did meet the Marshall family on my way in June of 1963. And first there was John Marshall, who was a filmmaker a little older than me, very famous for a film called The Hunters and a series of other films. And he was actively involved in the mid-60s in editing footage that he had taken when he was a 18-year-old high school and undergraduate. He went with his family on a now famous expedition to the northwestern Kalahari. So we met and had a very pleasant lunch. Then I met his mother, Lorna Marshall. And if you go to if you Google the Kung Bushman, her name will come up first, and maybe my name will come up second, maybe not. But she then was she had a master's from Radcliffe. She was already in her late 60s, and in her 50s, she had become a gifted amateur ethnographer. and went with the family to the Kalahari for the first time, I think, in 1950. I love the biographical details of Lorna Marshall. She was born in 1898, I think it was, in the New Mexico Territory before it became a state of the United States. She died, I believe, in 2003 in New Hampshire in retirement. So she lived in 3 centuries, the 19th, 20th, and 21st century. She was a very warm and generous person. Here am I, a young graduate student, going out and instead of feeling jealousy, it was very encouraging. And so she was very helpful and encouraging. I briefly met Lawrence Marshall, the father, the patriarch of the family, and learned a little bit more about the really interesting history of how this family ended up in the Kalahari Desert in the first place. And so shortly after the Second World War, Lawrence K. Marshall, an electrical engineer, founded a company, an electronics company, that became one of the stalwarts of or maybe it was during the Second World War, became one of the stalwarts of the American defense industry. The company's name is Raytheon, and Raytheon remains one of the top 100 companies in the United States. So he founded the company. It became a multi-million-dollar success even in the 1940s. And then he was bought out by other interests, and I've never sort of figured out who bought him out and why. But there he was with a young family of teenagers. There's a daughter, Elizabeth Marshall Thomas, and they have millions. He's bought out for multi-million-dollar buyout deal. And what are they going to do? So Lorna had been a great supporter of the Peabody Museum in Cambridge, Mass, at Harvard. And the director then of the museum said, well, you seem to be interested in Africa and in natural history. Why don't you go to the Kalahari? You have a family expedition to the Kalahari. And that's how the Marshall family began their incredible 50-year romance with the Kalahari Desert and the Kung people. And so when I got there in 1963, it was already 13 years after, but there was a difference. They did most of their, not all, but most of their research in Southwest Africa, which was a German colony until the First World War. Then it became a South African protectorate. And then finally, in 1990, it gained its independence as the new nation of Namibia. But at the time, in the 1950s, it was under the control of the apartheid regime of South Africa. I did my field work in Bechuanaland, which was a British colony. And so the two outcomes were the two countries had very different colonial policies, but until 1963, the Bechuanaland Kung and the Southwest Africa Kung were a single intermarrying population, and there was an almost imaginary line drawn, which you could look at a map of Africa and you could see the border, but when you were in the country, you couldn't find the border until somebody surveyed a dirt track that was supposed to follow the border. And so, but there was no fence or anything like that. So the Marshalls worked on the west side in in South African held territory, and I worked on the east side. So there was a division of labor there. And some of the most interesting experiences I had as a field worker were discovering that key informants in my field study were actually key informants in Lorna Marshall's field studies. It took years to figure it out because she spelled the names completely differently from me, and both of our orthographies were quite idiosyncratic and eventually became standardized in the 1990s, which is jumping way ahead in the story. So in the 60s, I met the Marshalls, was pleased to have a send-off from them, and off I went to Africa. I did spend some time with Irvin DeVore and his lovely wife, Nancy DeVore, and their two young children, Greg. Oh, I'm just blocking on the daughter's name, but it'll come back to me. And so I went with the DeVore family. He was doing a restudy of baboons in his in Nairobi Park in Kenya. And so I tagged along for that, but I was really waiting for my chance to go off into the Kalahari Desert and do the search for these elusive hunting and gathering people. So by September, the DeVores had gone back to Cambridge, and he was picking up his new job as a professor at Harvard. And just before we launched ourselves into actually in August, it was Irvin DeVore, myself in the car, in the vehicle, and just before we launched ourselves into the Kalahari, we got contacted by two UCLA professors, Leo Cooper and Hilda Cooper, who were South African exiles in exile from the apartheid system, who had taken jobs at UCLA. And they said, or Hilda said, would you be so kind, we have a nephew named Adam Cooper, K-U-P-E-R, who is a graduate student at Cambridge, and he's on one of these British grants where the entire grant is like 600 pounds. And he has no way of getting to the Kalahari, and he's picked a field site, or he'd like to pick a field site. Could he join you and accompany you? So it was at that moment that I met Adam Cooper in August of 1963, and the three of us took off in a Land Rover that we had purchased in Kenya and driven all the way from Kenya to Bechuanaland. Then we took off on our survey. And first we went to Adam Cooper's area, which was sort of western Bechuanaland, near the Southwest Africa border. And he ended up at a village near the border, which became his field site for the next 30 years. And he wrote a famous monograph called Kalahari Village Politics, and the ethnic group was the Bakhalahadi people, and he so became well known in anthropology for that field study. Then we proceeded to follow up some of the leads that we had received via Desmond Clark for serious examples of hunters and gatherers, of Bushmen who were still hunting and gathering. So we're on our way up towards the Southwest Africa border, and we're camped one night in mid-August, and we're heading to a place called Dobi. Only we'd never been there, we'd only heard of it, and actually the place that we heard of was called Kangwa. And we're camped for the night, and then we see a vehicle coming down the road from the west, from the direction we were heading in. And it stopped, and we met a man, a British guy, who introduced himself as a British colonial officer of the Bechuanaland Civil Service. And he said, "Where are you heading?" And so we said, "Well, we're trying to get to a place called Kongwa, which is supposed to be about 60 miles up the road from here." He said, "Well, I'm sorry to have to inform you that I can't let you go there." "Why?" He said, "Well, there's been some trouble on the border, and the conditions there are unsettled, and we just can't vouch for your safety. So I'm sorry I have to ask you to turn back." And we were very disappointed, but it was sort of like we're in a Graham Greene or Eric Ambler novel here, you know. The civil service is, telling us we can't go there. There's trouble on the border. My God, what could be going on? And we still don't know to this day, because when I finally got there about 6 weeks later, everything was calm as it can be. But I guess this young British civil servant liked to throw his weight around a little. So at that point, the three of us, DeVore, Adam Cooper, and myself, had to turn back and return to Livingstone, Zambia, which was still Northern Rhodesia in those days. And Adam, who was from Johannesburg originally, took the train to Johannesburg. Irv DeVore and his family took the plane to Lusaka, and then from there back to the United States. And I outfitted myself for a serious run of what I hope would be 6 or so months in the field, looking for and finding this elusive, forbidden population. So just before I took off, in late September, my girlfriend of the time was a woman from Ottawa named Marie Kingston, and she and I were, serious girlfriend and boyfriend at the time, and she had gone to Europe to sort of have one of those backpacking adventures that lots of people had then and now. And I said, "Well, let's see, you're going to be in Europe and I'm going to be in Africa. What do you say that you come and join me and we'll go to the field together?" And so she, I should say of her, she was a very intrepid young lady then. And I assumed that she was going to find a job, work, and fly down. But in fact, she hitchhiked from Europe to Bechuanaland. And there was no internet in those days. It was 30 years away. So occasionally I would get a postcard that read something like, "I just arrived in Juba in the South Sudan, after a very perilous 36-hour bus ride from Khartoum." And I thought, oh my God, what a gutsy lady she is. So we were, very much a couple in those days. And so finally, around the middle of September, she arrived at Livingstone after hitching a ride with some Yale paleontologists who were, admired her intrepidness as much as I did, and said, "You take good care of this young lady, because she's pretty special." And so she showed up, and then we outfitted, and then I thought I needed somebody to be my guide or interpreter. So Desmond Clark said, "Well, you should look up a certain fellow named Enoch Tabiso, who worked for me at the museum, the Rhodes Livingstone Museum, and who is a bushman. And so if you hire him, he might be, helpful to you." So I looked him up, found him, and hired him. And it turned out that his language, his Click language, was completely unintelligible to the Click language spoken by the Kung people. On the other hand, he was an extremely nice gentleman, probably in his late 30s, early 40s at the time. And he was, so he was hired by me as a cook, general cook and aide-de-camp. So off we went, Marie Kingston, Enoch Tabiso, and myself. And this time we went to, from Livingston to Pandamatenga, from Pandamatenga to Maui, Botswana, and around the southern end of the Okavango swamps to a place called Nokaneng. And we then headed west along an extremely bad road that required four-wheel drive, low range for miles and miles, and finally arrived in the area that I later came to call the Dobie area. And so I think that that's a good point to pause and take it from there.